Night air smelled like rain when I saw her. I had been volunteering at St. Catherine's Food Pantry every Thursday for the past 3 years, something I started doing after my husband passed, mostly to fill the hours between 4 and 7 when the house felt too quiet. I was behind the serving counter, ladling out beef stew, when I looked up and stopped cold. My daughter was standing in line, not visiting, not dropping something off, standing in line, holding a number, with my 9-year-old granddaughter, Maya, pressed close against her side. My daughter Carol, who owned a 3-bedroom colonial in Westfield, my daughter Carol, who had a master's degree in accounting and a job at a firm downtown that paid her well enough to take vacations and send Maya to a private school with a waiting list. She had not seen me yet. Her eyes were down, fixed on the linoleum floor, and she had pulled her hair forward the way she used to do as a teenager when she didn't want anyone to recognize her. Maya was gripping the hem of Carol's jacket with both fists. I set the ladle down. The woman next to me asked if I was all right. I walked around the counter. Carol looked up when she heard my footsteps, and the expression that crossed her face was something I have never been able to fully describe. It was shame and relief and exhaustion all at once, like someone who had been holding a door shut against the storm for so long that their arms had finally given out. "Mom," she said, that was all. Just that one word, and I already knew that whatever had happened, it was not small. I led her and Maya out of the line, over to a corner table, and I sat across from my daughter, and I took her hands in mine, and I asked her directly, "What happened to your house?" She looked at Maya, then back at me, and she said, "He took it, Mom. He took everything." I want to start from the beginning, because what happened to Carol did not happen overnight. It happened in layers, the way rot works, slowly, from the inside, invisible until the whole thing collapses. Carol met her husband Glenn at a conference in Chicago about 11 years ago. She was 34. She had spent her 30s building her career and had mostly stopped expecting that part of her life to work out. And then Glenn walked into a breakout session on tax compliance and made her laugh 3 times in 40 minutes. She called me that evening from her hotel room, and I could hear something in her voice that I had not heard in years. Glenn was charming. I will give him that. He was tall and well dressed, and he remembered details. He remembered that I preferred decaf, that I had a sister in Flagstaff, that Maya's stuffed rabbit was named Biscuit. He asked questions, and he listened to the answers, and he made you feel, when you were talking to him, like you were the most interesting person in the room. I liked him. I am not ashamed to say that. I liked him for a long time. They married after 2 years. Carol was pregnant with Maya by the end of the first year of marriage, which was earlier than they had planned, and Glenn's response was to go out that same evening and come home with a bottle of good champagne and a stuffed animal he had found at a drugstore on the way. He was, in those early years, the kind of husband you hoped your daughter would find. He was also, I know now, the kind of man who was always calculating. Glenn worked in commercial real estate. He had his own small firm, or what appeared to be his own small firm. I say appeared because I later learned that the actual ownership structure was considerably more complicated. But at the time, Carol and I simply understood that Glenn ran his own business, that it had good years and bad years, and that Carol's salary as an accountant was the stable foundation the family relied on. That part was always true. Carol's salary was always the foundation. What changed was what happened to it. The first sign came about 4 years into the marriage, and Carol told me about it only much later, after everything had fallen apart. Glenn had sat down with her one evening after Maya was in bed and told her that he wanted to consolidate their finances. They had been keeping mostly separate accounts since the wedding, with a joint account for household expenses, and Glenn said it would be simpler, more efficient if they combined everything. He had spreadsheets, he had projections. He had a calm, reasonable explanation for every question Carol raised, and by the end of the conversation, she had agreed. She told me later that she remembered thinking he was right, that it made sense, that married people should trust each other with money. What she didn't know was that Glenn had already, 6 months prior, quietly removed her name from the mortgage paperwork through a refinancing process he had handled entirely himself. With documents she had signed without reading carefully because he had always told her what they were for and she had always trusted him. She did not know because he was the one who managed the mail. He was the one who set up the online accounts. He was the one who told her not to worry about the paperwork side of things, that he would handle it, that she had enough on her plate with work and Maya. She was an accountant. She knew better. She told me that herself afterward, and she said it with a particular kind of grief that I recognized, the grief of someone who had applied their intelligence everywhere except the one place it was most needed, because that one place had felt like home. By the time Carol began noticing that something was wrong, Glenn had been systematically dismantling her financial life for nearly 2 years. The first thing she noticed was a credit card bill. It arrived in paper form, which was unusual because they had gone paperless on almost everything. It was for a card she did not remember applying for, in her name, with a balance of just over $11,000. When she asked Glenn about it, he was calm, unworried. He told her she must have applied during a promotion, that she'd mentioned it once and he hadn't thought much of it. He told her she worked long hours and sometimes forgot small things. He said it gently, with the kind of concern that felt like care and was actually something else entirely. Carol paid the bill. She assumed he was right. The second thing she noticed, about 4 months later, was a letter from her pension administrator. She had not looked closely at her retirement account in some time because Glenn managed their finances and she trusted the system they had built together. The letter indicated that a partial distribution had been taken the previous year, a sum just over $40,000, citing a qualified domestic distribution order. She did not know what that was. When she looked it up, she learned it was a legal mechanism typically used during divorce proceedings. She asked Glenn about it that evening, and this time the explanation was more elaborate. He said there had been a tax strategy he had discussed with their financial advisor, that this was part of a restructuring, that she had signed the relevant paperwork at some point. He pulled out a document with her signature on it, and she looked at her name written there and thought, I do not remember signing this. But she had signed many things. Glenn had always told her what they were. She began, around this time, to experience what she described to me as a kind of mental fog. She would go to remember something specific, a conversation, a document, a decision, and find the memory blurred or absent. Glenn had a name for it. He called it her overload episodes. He said it happened when she was working too hard, running on too little sleep, stretched too thin between the job and Maya and the house. He was sympathetic about it. He brought her tea and told her to rest. He told their friends, with a worried smile, that Carol had been pushing herself too hard. She believed him for longer than I wish she had. But I understand why. When the person closest to you tells you that your own mind is unreliable and tells you with love and backs it up with your own signature on papers you cannot remember signing, the ground shifts beneath you in a way that is very hard to explain to someone who hasn't felt it. The house was the last thing she discovered. She found out by accident. Carol had taken Maya to a pediatric appointment and arrived home earlier than expected. Glenn was on the phone in his office with the door partially open, and she heard him say an address, her address, the address of their house, and a number that she first thought was a repair estimate. She stood in the hallway and listened, and the number was not a repair estimate. It was a sale price. $260,000, and Glenn was confirming the closing date. She pushed the door open. He ended the call smoothly and turned around, and for a fraction of a second before the mask went back on, she saw something in his face that she had never seen before. Not guilt. Exactly, something colder than guilt. He told her she had misheard, that it was a client property, nothing to do with their house. He told her she was tired, that the fog was back, that she needed to sit down. He said all of this in a steady, gentle voice, and Carol stood in the doorway of her own home and felt the floor tilt beneath her and thought, I don't know what's real anymore. She didn't confront him again that night, but she didn't let it go either. That was the moment something shifted. Something quiet and certain settled into place behind her eyes, and she decided she was going to find out the truth herself without telling Glenn she was looking. It took her 3 weeks. She started with the property records, pulling them from the county assessor's website during her lunch break at work. What she found made her sit very still at her desk for a long time. The house had been refinanced twice in 4 years, each time with her name absent from the new documentation. The most recent refinancing had occurred 7 months ago. Current owner of record, GKP Holdings LLC. She looked up GKP Holdings. It was registered in Delaware. The registered agent was Glenn's brother, Paul. She pulled her own credit report next, and what she found there was a second kind of sickness entirely. 5 credit cards she had never applied for, 2 personal loans, a line of credit attached to a business account she had never seen. Every one of them was in her name. The combined balance was just over $94,000. She did not go home that evening. She drove to a parking lot 3 blocks from Maya's school, and she sat in her car, and she called the one person she had not called in far too long. She called her sister. She called me. I answered on the second ring, and she said, "Mom, I need help. I think I'm in serious trouble and I don't know what to do." And I said, "Tell me where you are. I'll come right now." I want to say something here because I know how easy it is to ask the question that many people ask when they hear a story like this. Why didn't she come to me sooner? She has a mother. She had family. Why did she wait until she was parked in a lot with nowhere to go before she picked up the phone? I have asked myself that question and I have answered it over and over until I understood. Carol did not come to me because Glenn had spent years making her feel that needing help was a form of weakness that reflected poorly on her. Not in words, never in direct words. He did it through implication, through a tone of voice, through the way he told stories about other couples with a certain kind of smile that communicated very clearly what kind of person it was acceptable to be. She had internalized it. By the end, the voice telling her not to ask for help was not Glenn's voice anymore, it was her own. That is what gaslighting does. It colonizes your internal monologue and makes you believe the prison is your own idea. I drove to that parking lot in 20 minutes. I brought Maya into my car and I turned the heat on and I let Carol talk for a long time without interrupting. And then I told her what we were going to do. My younger brother, as it happens, spent 22 years as a forensic accountant before he retired. I called him that night. He came over the next morning with a yellow legal pad in a calm, methodical manner, and he sat at my kitchen table with Carol and went through everything she had managed to gather. By the end of 3 hours, he set down his pen and said, in the mild, measured tone that is just his way, "This is fraud, multiple counts. Whoever did this is going to federal prison." He helped Carol compile the documentation, property records, credit reports, the pension distribution paperwork, photographs of the signature pages with the dates, emails she had found on a shared account that neither she nor Glenn used much anymore, which Glenn had apparently forgotten existed, in which he and Paul discussed the property transfers explicitly. He also called a colleague of his, a woman named Diane, who worked in financial crimes enforcement, and Diane made a call, and within 2 weeks, there were people with federal credentials looking at Glenn's business records. What they found was larger than Carol had known. The house was only one piece. Glenn and Paul had been running a pattern of financial fraud across multiple fronts for over a decade. Carol was not their first victim. There were 2 previous wives, both of whom had experienced similar financial destruction, and neither of whom had been able to make a case that stuck. There were business partners who had lost investments. There were accounts in 4 different states. The real estate business was largely a vehicle for laundering money through property transactions that looked legitimate on paper. Glenn was arrested on a Tuesday morning, 6 weeks after Carol and I sat in my car in that parking lot. Paul was arrested the same day in a different city. The federal charges included wire fraud, identity theft, bank fraud, and money laundering, among others. The criminal complaint was 43 pages long. I am not going to pretend the legal process was swift or simple. It was not. There were months of proceedings. There were civil suits running parallel to the criminal case. There were days when Carol called me and I could hear in her voice that the weight of it was almost more than she could carry. Maya was confused and frightened. Carol had to explain things to her in pieces, in age appropriate fragments that her daughter slowly assembled into a picture no 9-year-old should have to understand. But the house came back. That happened first, actually, before the criminal case was resolved. The civil proceeding to reverse the fraudulent property transfer moved relatively quickly once the federal investigation was underway, and Carol got the house back with clean title. The credit card debts were cleared once fraud was established. Her pension recovery took longer and was only partial, but the civil judgment against Glenn and Paul's assets covered a significant portion of what had been taken. Glenn was sentenced to 16 years. Paul received 11. The judge in the case made specific remarks about the sustained, deliberate nature of the fraud and the number of victims, and about the use of intimate trust as a mechanism of theft. I was in the courtroom for the sentencing. I watched Glenn listen to the judge speak, and I watched his face, and I thought about how well he had learned to perform emotions he did not feel. Carol is doing well now. That is the thing I most want to say, the thing that matters most. She still lives in the house in Westfield. She repainted the living room last spring, a warm yellow that Maya chose. She has been in therapy for 2 years, and she told me recently that she finally feels, for the first time since all of this began, like the thoughts in her head belong to her again, like the voice telling her what she's worth is actually hers. Maya is doing well. She is resilient in the way that children can be when they know they are loved, and she is loved, fiercely and without qualification, by her mother and by me and by the rest of our family, who have all shown up in the ways they knew how to. I volunteer at St. Catherine's Food Pantry every Thursday, the same as always. I am back behind the serving counter with the ladle and the beef stew and the particular satisfaction of feeding people who need to be fed. But sometimes I stop and I look up at the faces in the line and I think about all the things that can be happening behind someone's eyes that you cannot see, all the ways a person can be in trouble that don't show on the surface, all the different reasons a person might not ask for help until the situation has stripped everything else away. I think about Carol standing in that line with her number and her child and her downcast eyes, hoping I wouldn't see her. I think about how close she came to walking back out. If you have someone in your life who seems like they're holding something too heavy, reach out. Don't wait for them to ask. The asking is often the hardest part, and sometimes it never comes. I got lucky. I looked up at the right moment. Not everyone does.